Hey everybody, Qroo Paul here. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about how to use the verb convencer to convince. Now, this video was inspired by one of the members of my paid learning group, the Qroo Spanish Crew. He recently asked me to make a video on this topic because he said, you know what, I sometimes see this with de que or para que. Sometimes it's followed by the subjunctive, sometimes the indicative, so it'd be a good idea for a video. And I know that sounds very complicated, a lot of grammatical terms going on, but don't worry. It's not, okay? Just like everything else in Spanish, we can simplify it and break it down into some very simple formulas that are easy to remember. You can take them out, pop them in with your other formulas, and come up with your own sentences. So we're going to move into our first formula, convencer a alguien de plus a noun. Now that whole convince a alguien something, that's literally to convince someone of something. We'll end up changing that, to a person. Sometimes we'll use object pronouns, etc. One thing that's not going to change, well, probably won't change, is we're going to be using that preposition de with convencer all the time. So even if you just have it on your word list like that, convencer de. So you'll remember to use de all the time. And you'll hear me say that 1,000 times. I encourage people to learn verbs with their preposition, especially if the preposition is not always yes, because it doesn't match English. And that's going to be the case here. Sometimes you're like, oh, I think that matches English. And sometimes you're like, wow, I didn't expect that. This is the case. So convencer de. Let's take a look at that first formula, and we're going to drop in somebody. Quiero convencer a Juan de la importancia de llegar a tiempo. I want to convince Juan of the importance of arriving on time. Now see, I kicked that one off with just a simple verb, one of the first verbs I teach you in the Spanish Master Course. Quiero, I want. That way you don't have to conjugate the second verb, you can just pop it in. So even if you didn't know how to really conjugate convencer, you're like, oh, I can still work that into the patterns I already know. That's why I gave it to you that way. Now, quiero convencer a Juan. That is a personal a. That's why that's there, because Juan is an object of the sentence. We don't use personal a's when it's the subject, but I'm the subject and Juan is the object. There is our preposition de, right? We're convincing Juan of. You're like, okay, that seems not too far off from English. Agreed. I'll give you that one. De la importancia de. Now, learning Spanish is all about like taking little sections and just take them out of your Spanish toolbox. I think that is a fantastic one. De la importancia de. Or without the de if you're not popping in here. La importancia de. The importance of something. Now, after that, I can plug in anything. I can plug in a noun. Quiero convencer a Juan de la importancia de su decisión. Of the importance of his decision. Or I can just plug in an infinitive, a verb, right? Don't have to conjugate it. We try to get around conjugation. Quiero convencer a María de la importancia de ir a la playa. I want to convince Maria of the importance of going to the beach. Now, I know that sounded very long. It sounded very, elegant, but it's just little patterns we're popping together. Now, this pattern with the noun, you'll also hear this in like legal proceedings, like you're convincing a jury of something. El abogado busca convencer al jurado de la inocencia de su cliente. The lawyer looks to or is trying to convince the jury of his client's innocence. Now, that's an interesting use of the verb buscar, which means to look for. And you can seek to do something like we see here and use buscar. Just another usage for a verb you probably already know, right? Now, this formula with the noun, you're going to hear it, but you'll definitely hear the next one a lot more in everyday conversations. I think it's a lot more useful. Convencer a alguien de plus infinitive. Remember, the infinitive is the unconjugated form of the verb. We're just going to plug it in. And this is when we're convincing someone to do something, okay? We want them to take some action or possibly not take an action, but we're trying to, persuade them. Quiero convencer a mi esposa de ir a la playa. I want to convince my wife to go to the beach. Now, do you see that de there? Didn't anticipate that one, did you? You're like, would not have thought that would have been a de, Paul. Now you know. Now you know why we learn it as convencer de, right? We want that de to be somewhere. Now, so far we keep mentioning the object. But what if I just wanted to say, I want to convince her to go to the beach. All right? How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do that. We're going to use direct object pronouns. Maybe you recognize those. They're up there on the screen. Me, te, lo, la, nos, os. Spain only, folks. If you're studying Latin American Spanish, just don't even pay attention to that little os there. Just leave it off your list. And then los and las. Now, if you have no idea what a direct object pronoun is, I have several videos on the topic. You should watch them after. I'm not going to, segue into that. But there they are. So now, right, we're talking about a female, my wife, so it's going to be la. Where are we going to put la, though? We have to decide where to put it. Well, with this particular sentence, we actually have two options, because we can put it before the conjugated verb, right? La quiero convencer de ir a la playa. Or, because there is an infinitive here, after our conjugated verb, we can also attach it to the infinitive. Quiero convencerla de ir a la playa. Now, as English speakers, we tend to like that one better because it matches our word order, but there's no change in meaning from one to the other. It is just dealer's choice, okay? Now that you understand this pattern, okay, you can easily build it into more complex sentences by adding it to other patterns you may know. Come up with something like, ¿Estás tratando de convencerme de dejar mi trabajo? Are you trying to convince me to quit my job or leave my job? I'm saying it that way because it's literally to leave my job, so it sticks in your head, but it's quit my job. Now, at first glance, that looks pretty intimidating, right? That sentence, you're like, it's long, but it's not. It's just several patterns that we pop together, okay? Estás tratando de, and as a question, ¿Estás tratando de? Are you trying to do something? So that's another little pattern. So we have tratar de plus infinitive is to try to do something, right? So are you trying to what? Convencerme, to convince me. Of what? De, right? Don't want to forget that de. Dejar mi trabajo, leave my job. Now that you have that formula down, let's make it a little bit more complicated. Convencer a alguien de que plus subjunctive. Yes, the subjunctive, folks, it is the keystone to learning Spanish. I talk about it all the time. If you don't know what the subjunctive is, just think of it as a different set of conjugations that are triggered by certain grammatical constructions. And the easiest way to learn it is to learn what triggers it, and to do that, you just break it down into formulas. Here's an easy trigger. I have a book of subjunctive triggers. This is not in there because I don't think it's as useful, but I have a ton of high-frequency ones broken down into formulas. You can easily, work in your Spanish, even if you're an absolute beginner. All right, so you'll find a link to that in the description section. All right, so let's get back on this one. Plus subjunctive. Now, we're going to be using this formula the same way we use the one with just de, right? We're trying to persuade someone to take some action. ¿Estás tratando de convencerme de que deje mi trabajo? So that was a lot longer, right? It's the same thing I said before, except I have de que, and then I have deje mi trabajo. Deje is in the subjunctive, right? Like I said, it's just a different set of conjugations. The plain old present tense would be deja, and here it's deje. That's basically it. Now, when it comes to choosing which one you're going to do, if you're going to have de que plus subjunctive or just de plus infinitive, I think it's really going to come down to the sentence. It's a personal choice. In this particular circumstance, personally, I would choose the shorter version, just, de plus infinitive. ¿Estás tratando de convencerme de dejar mi trabajo? It's just easier, especially in a conversation. But again, you be you. It's dealer's choice, all right? Now I'm going to test your memory. You're like, uh-oh, I didn't take good notes. It's going to be pretty easy. Do you remember at the beginning of this video, I mentioned the Qroo Spanish Crew member, that inspired all this, that one of the things he asked about is, he's like, sometimes I see this with de que, but sometimes para que. Do you remember that? Maybe you don't. I'm going to address it now anyway. Now, you will definitely see this with para que, okay, after convencer, when it's being used to persuade someone, influence someone, okay? And it's going to be followed by the subjunctive as well. El director convenció a Juan para que aceptara el puesto. The director convinced Juan to accept the position. Now, you can do that. You could also use de que in there. You could also have just said de aceptar, all right? Now, when it comes to using para que, you're trying to decide between para que and de que, I would just stick with de que. Why? Well, because de que also works when the indicative is required, right? We're going to have de que plus indicative. You're like, did you mention the indicative, Paul? No, I did not. So Since I haven't, let's go ahead and talk about that. So that is our other formula. We're going to talk about convencer a alguien de que plus indicative. And the indicative is just the plain old tense, all right? It's not the subjunctive. It's the ones, you already learned, and then you heard about the subjunctive, and you're like, what is that? The plain old tenses. Now with this one, we're not trying to convince anyone to do something. We're trying to simply convince them, that something's true or not true, some fact. That's the difference between the construction with the subjunctive and this one. For example, and I think examples help because you're probably like, what are you talking about? For example, Juan me convenció de que la empresa me apoyaría si hubiera problemas. Juan convinced me that the company would support me if there were problems, right? He's just convincing me of that fact. It's not trying to get me to do something. He's not trying to convince me to quit or to move to Mexico or go to the beach or anything like that. Do you see the difference there? Maybe one more example. María me convenció de que tenía razón. Maria convinced me that she was right. See, she's not telling me to do anything. That's the difference. So here are the patterns on the board that we talked about today. And if you want to learn them this way, that's fine. If you just want to learn them like convencer de plus noun, convencer de plus infinitive, convencer de que plus subjunctive, convencer de que plus indicative, whatever works for you. Well, that's all I have for this particular video. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, do me a favor and give it a thumbs up. And until next time, hasta luego. Oh, yeah, the cup does say Mrs. Should probably address that because I know somebody's going to make a comment about that. It's my wife's cup. She doesn't know I have it. Well, I was going to say she will when she watches the video, but she doesn't actually follow this channel. So, well, until next time, hasta luego.